influence through understanding the true gospel and sharing it. Through the church, through family, through marriage, through the totality of our lives spent looking upward and looking outward, through becoming less and showing more. More God, more Jesus, more Holy Spirit, more opening the possibilities for the real influencer to move. It is my pleasure to introduce our next speaker, Rice Brooks.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for ushering the presence of God in today, Pastor John. As we talk this morning practically about evangelism, you see a book on your seat, God's Not Dead. That's a gift. Hopefully you'll see how it fits in our time today in terms of the things we'll talk about. Usually when I'm introduced, my name is Rice. People wonder about that name. When I was in high school, I played basketball, but I wasn't very good. So I sat on the end of the bench and got in at the last minute, so they call me Minute Rice. I would be kind of the last guy in. Hated the name. Even though one of my relatives actually founded Rice University, that meant nothing to a kid growing up, with that name. When I got older and all of a sudden I began to go around the world, I realized that, they really like me in China, So to my Hispanic brothers, I'm arroz. When I introduce myself to somebody, it's arroz con pollo? No, arroz con Jesus. So, diversity, Pastor John was talking about diversity and coming into a context that was not familiar. I pastor a congregation in Nashville, Tennessee, and serve a larger congregation, a set of congregations called Every Nation, which is a church planting movement. We focus on college campuses. But when I became pastor in Tennessee, it was mostly a white church in the year 2000. And because I love the nations, I wanted to see a diverse people built. But if you're going to accomplish something, you have to kind of pick things up. It's not always the big sign, it's not always the big thing, and so I wanted to see a diverse congregation built. Our congregation now is about 45% African American, 35% white, and the rest the different nations. And people come into our midst and they say, "How did you do this? How did this happen?" And when you go to any place that's successful in any area, you're going to ask that question, what happened here? And it wasn't by accident, it was intentional. And there are little signs, little cues, little things that, and maybe this morning my prayer is that we can pick some things up. Growing up in the South, wanting to see diversity, hating the phrase that the most segregated hour was the 11 a.m. worship hour on Sunday. So beginning to build that diverse congregation, and I noticed among African American men that they acknowledged one another. If you're ever walking and you see one African American, just bring it down here, one brother to another, they'll give one another a little courtesy nod. Do you ever notice that? It's like, I like that. I picked that up. So one day I was walking down through the airport with a African-American friend of mine, and we're walking through the airport like this, and another black guy's coming this way, and my African-American friend, and he gives him a courtesy nod. But he didn't see it, so I stepped in there and picked it up for him. You can see that brother kind of looking, get out of my nod, what are you doing? How did you know to get in this nod and see there's things that God wants us to pick up? They're subtle. When I was in high school and rejecting pretty much religion, when I got into college, somebody about half my size got in my face and began to talk to me about Jesus. And as a third-year college student, I came to Christ. The problem was I had to go home and talk to my family. Now, my older brother was in his last year of law school. He was in his third year of law school at Southern Methodist University. He had a master's degree in counseling and psychology. He was a debater. He was kind of the smart guy in our family. And when my brother found out that I had become a Christian, he came home to talk me out of the Christian faith. He started studying the Bible to find all the contradictions. You ever talk to people like that? They say, well, the Bible's so full of contradictions. And I usually have one. I said, well, let's talk about it. And they'll back away because they've never been that close. They'll say, there's just so many. And I go, well, good. It ought to be easy to find one. And then I'll usually agree with them at the end of it. I'll say, the Bible does have a lot of contradictions. It contradicts most of what you do. And the reason why most people don't like the Bible is it's because of what they see when they look into it. It's a perfect mirror. I remember growing up and my mother had a makeup mirror. One side was normal and the other side was magnified with lights all around it. And I remember the first time I turned that over and looked into that magnified mirror with lights on and understood at that moment why women wear makeup. Because I probably could have put some on to cover some stuff up. I mean, the lights and the magnification shows the flaws. And when you see ourselves, but see, God doesn't just show us what we look like. He shows us on the other side of his mirror what we can be. And so my brother was looking at all the contradictions in the Bible, and I didn't really know a lot, but I knew enough. I was thankful that on the campus where I became a Christian at Mississippi State University that I had enough discipleship so that I had at least, remember when Mo used to poke Curly in the eye and he could put his hand up like that to stop it? I at least had enough to block that insult. And so my big brother came home from law school to talk me out of the Christian faith. He had all these contradictions, and really by the end of the moment, I said to him, I said, look, it's not what you don't know about God that's keeping you from him. It's not what you don't know, it's what you do know. The book of Romans says that people suppress the truth. It's like taking a beach ball and trying to hold it under the water. And the weekend that my big brother came home to talk me out of the Christian faith, we baptized him. And I remember when he came up out of the water, he looked at me, he said, you haven't really answered all of my questions, but I think I was asking the wrong question. My brother's an attorney today in Texas, still is fired up or more on fire than me. But that began a journey for me, because if God could have changed him, if God can change him, he can change anybody. And so I began to travel, and so our movement is really focused on college campuses. We plant churches that target young people, college campus cities. So now we're on hundreds of college campuses in about 60 countries, because if you change the campus, you change the world. Now, throughout that process, I began to realize, as we were seeing things happen really all over the world, good things happening in America, there began to be a trend, a noticeable trend, and everybody knows the statistics. I'm a missiologist. That's my doctoral degree, is missiology. I have a friend that's a fellow missiologist named Ed Stetzer, and Ed and I just talked to him last night. He's probably going to listen to this or watch this streaming here, because we talk about the phenomenon of what's going on in the country and track it, and because I like to know what the score is. I was sitting in Tennessee at a high school football game, and everybody was staring at the scoreboard, but the scoreboard was broken. And it didn't work, but people still stared at it to something that gave them no accurate feedback. We need to know where we are. Not because we're trying to somehow show off, because look, if you're on the Titanic and it's going down like this, if the Titanic is going down and you've got a restaurant in the top, if your restaurant is in the top here and the ship's going down, just because a lot of people are coming doesn't necessarily mean you're in a good place. We've got great churches, but you know what? If we don't all come together and do something, our version of Christianity, especially in America, might end up like it says in the book of Revelation. Jesus said, I'm coming personally and unplug the thing. I'm turning the lights off. That's what the warning was. And when you go to Turkey or you go into that where Revelation was speaking about, the lights are certainly out. But when I began to look at these trends, I started writing the book that you have on your seat, God's Not Dead. And so I was telling a friend of mine who actually is sitting here, like on the third row, Troy Duhan, Cajun fella, probably 18 years old before he found out gravy was not a beverage. I told him about what I was writing, and he said, that needs to be a movie. And so he goes to a movie company called PureFlix, a man named Michael Scott, whom I think will be here. They come to Nashville, and I begin to explain the drama of what goes on the college campus, the challenge that young people are leaving the faith. And they put together this script called God's Not Dead. Troy wrote the check, a large check for the movie, and I don't know, 20 million people have seen it. I've had the privilege of going around the world and talking about it and showing the movie or talking and doing God's Not Dead events on campus. But I want to talk today because beyond, even as we sat that day in Nashville talking about what a movie would look like, and I remember saying this repeatedly, and I say it still, we're not after just movie, selling tickets and doing this. We need a movement. We need 1 million young people in this country who can defend their faith, that it's not just a subjective experience. You see, a lot of people, when they get to college, they've had an experience. It's a subjective experience, but yet once all of it's gone and then they meet a real genuine critic with a genuine question, sometimes it just falls apart. Some of the greatest skeptics in the world today were once believers who basically got taken out by a drive-by shooting intellectually. The objection they heard could have easily been answered, but it was like dying from something like from a common cold. And so I want to just talk to you in the next several hours that we have together. Let me go if this works. They may have a garage door opener here. It's coming. Okay? Is it there? There it is. The angel Gabriel appears to Daniel, and Gabriel is there in chapter 9, but it's pretty much inferred by scholars that this was Gabriel, and he's basically telling Daniel what's to come. And he says, and those who are wise shall shine like the brightness of the sky above, and those who turn many to righteousness like the stars forever and ever. But think about this. This is to this great prophet Daniel. This is this charge that if you want to be great in essence, there's going to be many people that turn many to righteousness. That same angel shows up to Zechariah about 500 years later maybe. And there's Zechariah, and he's being told about a prophet coming named John, and he says, and you will have joy and gladness, and many will rejoice at his birth, for he will be great before the Lord. He must not drink wine or strong drink. He will be filled with the Spirit, even from his mother's womb, and he will turn many of the children of Israel to the Lord their God. So the great word, we love to throw around hyperbole. Everything's great, this is great, but really we look at books called Good to Great, and we'll try to copy not to say it's wrong, but I'm just wondering what the good to great is in terms of the spiritual principles. Greatness is possible. We are made in God's image. God is great. Everybody would agree with that. So if you are made in his image, then that means you and I were made for greatness. There's something in us that calls us to something great. We like great teams. We like to see great performances. We want to see. But when God says something is great, when he says he will be great in the eyes of the Lord, he's going to turn many back to the Lord their God. But it won't be to the exclusion of his character. His character, he's going to be set apart. He's going to be sanctified. He's going to be not just a nice, clean kid. He's going to be filled with the Spirit. But yet he's going to take all that, and he's going to turn many back to the Lord God. And this is what the goal is today. My hope today, and to help us remember it, I'm going to just take the word great because we see it associated with what the angel said about John being great. And I want to talk about 5 key principles that are important if you and I are going to have a culture of evangelism in our churches. Now, if you go into a church, you can find out what they value. You can see wonderful worship. I'm talking to pastors a lot, and they're saying, man, we just can't seem to get evangelism consistent. We just kind of hope that people will come and experience the presence of God. And I'll begin to kind of deconstruct it. I said, well, you got a worship leader, don't you? Yep. And you got a worship team, yes. And you practice every week. Do you know that there are things you can do in evangelism, just like worship, that if you do them consistently, you can have an evangelism process? One of my college roommate and I went to the Philippines in the 80s, and I spoke for 30 straight nights as an evangelist, which is, I'm going to get to that in just a moment. He was left behind. The church is now, has 102 weekend services, 10,000 small groups, and I'll let you guess the numbers. But his 3 sons are all tennis players. They all got scholarships to play tennis. And he said the key to process is same old boring strokes. Same old boring strokes. The consistency of every day, just the practice of the same old boring strokes. Whoever the golfer is, I remember hearing when Tiger Woods was this rising star, and people thought, well, maybe he has some secret talent, maybe he had some secret drink. No, it's same old boring strokes. It's same old boring strokes. Thousands of times of repetition. And I believe if you deconstruct, and that's what I do, I basically study, not only do I lead a congregation and serve in a movement of churches, but I'm also concerned with the process so that every church can win. Every church can win. Regardless of your size, you can put some principles into practice and you can see the results. So let's just take real quickly the word gospel. Let's take the word, well, let me just go to this. There was 3 things that we're going to address, and I can't reverse on the slide. Oh, there it is, good. There was 3 things that really precipitated the God's Not Dead book. Number 1 was the falling away, young people walking away from the faith. Now, the statistics are grim. A lot of them, I've heard people say things like 85% of young people who leave high school and get to college will abandon their faith. That is just not true. Maybe we think if we make the statistic higher that everybody will be scared into action. It's still a very high number. I would say it's safe to say that a majority of young people will leave high school, and when they get to college, they'll somehow get lost. Again, because you're going to need more than an experience of Jesus to withstand what's coming. The intellectual assault that's coming your way, you're going to have a response. Number 2, a failure to prepare these people for the skeptical challenges. There are skeptical challenges, and they're not nice. We'll talk about that in just a moment. And then a fraction of churches. This was something that in my doctoral work at Fuller Seminary, the number was about 3% of churches in America that are growing through evangelism. 80% plateau to declining, 17% who do grow. It's just migration of believers. We used to call it transfer growth, but that would imply you actually joined. So migration of believers, 3%. So is it any wonder that when we look out and wonder what's happening to the country, what does the scoreboard say? Now that doesn't mean that it's all bad news. There are some things we can do, and that's why I want to take this moment and just talk about this process. The first, we're going to take the word great. The first of the 5 principles I'm going to quickly mention is the gospel. We talk about the gospel is the power of God, but do you know that most Christians can't articulate the gospel succinctly? And I was raised Presbyterian. We didn't raise our hand unless we had a question. And I remember, coming into a spirit-filled context in college where I was saved and baptized with the Spirit. The power of God was very real, but I'm thankful that the people that discipled me helped me be able to articulate the gospel. When you ask somebody the gospel, they'll go, it's like asking them, how do you get to Atlanta? They go, woo, I love Atlanta. I got a lot of friends there, but they can't tell you specifically how to get there. In my little neighborhood where I live, I've had people actually say, can you tell me how to get to so-and-so street? I mean, of course, now you go plug it into the GPS, but you think in my own neighborhood, I could tell them, oh, you go here. Usually I go, you're going to have to just follow me. And that's what we end up doing. We say, just come to church. Just come to church. I can't really tell you the gospel, but just come to church and I'll show you. I was at one particular campus ministry that was touted as one of the finest in the country, and hundreds of kids. It was during finals week. So I stood up to talk, and when I did, I stopped. I said, okay, everybody take out a sheet of paper, and write out in the next 5 minutes what is the gospel. They turned it in. I said, this is going to be your first test. When I looked at the sheets of paper of what they said the gospel was, it was so vague, it was so confused. Probably about 15% of the students could give a clear presentation of what the gospel is. And so one of the key things, if you know nothing else or do nothing else, to go back and say, how can we build an evangelism culture in our church? Then here it is. The gospel is the good news. This is a definition. Growing up in the Presbyterian church, we would stand and recite the Lord's Prayer or the Apostles' Creed or the doxology. This becomes, again, the same old boring strokes. The gospel is the good news that God became man in Jesus Christ. He lived a life we should have lived, meaning that he lived perfectly the moral law. He died the death we should have died in our place. 3 days later, he rose from the dead, proving he's the Son of God and offering the gift of salvation and forgiveness of sins to everyone who repents and believes in him. Now, my kids can recite this. Our church is built upon the thing, if nothing else that you do, memorize and master the gospel, because in the gospel are I'm going to break into Nacho Libre, are the strength and nutrients that you need that can help you withstand the initial skeptical assault. God becomes man in Jesus Christ. You know, in Jesus, we don't just have a prophet. We don't just have a good man. We don't just have somebody that they go, yeah, you know, he's having all these all-you-can-eat dinners, boat rides where you ride out and walk back, and he gets a following. What we have is God himself. Every prophet that ever spoke would say, thus saith the Lord. When Jesus spoke, he didn't say, thus saith the Lord. He said, truly I say to you. Why? Because the Lord was speaking. And what does he do? He lives the life we should have lived. It didn't mean we walk around in a robe and talk scripture necessarily, but he lived perfectly the moral law. And then he died the death we should have died in our place. 3 days later, he rose from the dead in history, proving he's the Son of God. The sequel to God's Not Dead, God's really not dead. No, the sequel will be out this March. I'm finishing a book right now that will go along with that movie called Man, Myth, Messiah. And it's basically talking about the evidence for the historical Jesus. How do we know that Jesus really did live? Now, I was just here at the newsstand, and right here is this Newsweek magazine, and it's actually a Newsweek special edition. I think they went out of print. We wonder why once we hear what they say about Jesus. The 100 people who shaped our world, okay? And if you open it up to Jesus, Jesus of Nazareth, they have a brief couple of paragraphs about Jesus. And immediately they begin to talk about the doubts about the historical Jesus, you know. Was Jesus really who he said he was? And then of all things, at the bottom, they say to learn more, read Reza Aslan, Zealot. Now, Reza Aslan is an Iranian who was born Muslim, was a Muslim growing up, became a Christian when he moved to America, and is now converted back to Islam. And his book on Zealot is basically saying that we can't believe anything in the Gospels. The Gospels are thrown out, discredited, and that Jesus was some kind of revolutionary sage. And of all things, that's the one reference to who Jesus is. Or maybe it's Bill Maher, the late-night comedian, and his movie called Religulous, where he begins to try to say that Jesus was just, the story was borrowed from pagan mythology. When you look and see the historical evidence, it was really the pagans who, after the success of Christianity, said, let's retell our stories because this one is a lot better, and made it look like that. But see, we don't understand that. So number one, we have to understand the gospel. Number two, and this is kind of right into this, we need, and we're spelling out the word great, reasons. 1 Peter 3:15. 1 Peter 3:15 says, but in your hearts sanctify, honor Christ as Lord. Always be prepared to give a defense to anyone who asks you for a reason for the hope that's within you. Now, somehow we have this notion that reason is anti-God or anti-spiritual. I went to, in writing this book, this was the Global Atheist Convention in Melbourne, Australia. I have my man Greg who took this video, and we had video and visual, so there I am kind of sitting in the back. I love being the creeper at the Atheist Convention. But you know, you had the stars, Richard Dawkins, Sam Harris, the late Christopher Hitchens was scheduled to be there, the who's who in the atheist world, and here was their mantra. They said, faith is dangerous because it's blind. And really the truth is that real faith isn't blind. It's based on evidence. It's not the lack of evidence that is keeping someone from God. It's a preponderance of evidence. There's an overwhelming amount of evidence, from the creation of the universe to the complexity of life. We can go down the line. It's not that you don't have enough evidence, it's you're stalling. You've got way more evidence than you need. Now you need to make a decision on what you already know is true. We have to prepare, and that's why if you open up the God's Not Dead book, it's literally written to give you the summations of the evidence for God. I was at one university campus, and I stood up in front of this classroom, University of New Orleans, and I said, you have two choices. I said, either the universe created itself or it was started by something besides itself. You think that's pretty much a logical option. You know, the universe either started itself, everything you see, or it was started by something besides itself. And a student in the back raised their hand and they go, there's a third option. And I go, what is it? He goes, maybe we're not here at all. I said, well, in that case, you wouldn't be here, so please be quiet. But the universe had a beginning. It had a cause. What could be the cause if they say, and this is why I'm not trying to fight the language, if they say everything came into existence out of nothing from the Big Bang, then you had nothing and then there's something. So you have to answer the question, why is there something rather than nothing, as the mathematician Gottfried Leibniz, co-founder of differential calculus, said in the 1700s. Why is there something rather than nothing? But what could be the cause of time and space? If time and space came into existence out of nothing, then the cause of the universe would have to be timeless and spaceless, uncaused, uncreated. You're beginning to get the picture of why Romans 1 says the nature and attributes of God are clearly seen, being understood through what is made. You ever gotten a pocket text from somebody? Somebody sit on their phone and they send you this nonsense message and you look at it. I mean, what happens if you looked at a message and it was a complete sentence? Don't tell anyone, but I cheated on the test, if you're a student. No one could have sat on the phone and constructed that and then hit the send button. You would know that you may have accidentally sent that text, but you did not construct that by just some arbitrary means. What if you got a text from somebody 3.1 billion letters long, ordered and sequenced? That's the information that's in human DNA. The world's longest sentence. We begin to understand that there are reasons for the Christian faith, and we can give that evidence, and we train people. We have to train them to do this. I had the privilege I have a physicist who works with me Brian's down here. He went to MIT, lost his faith at MIT, went to Duke University to get his PhD in physics, and actually got saved because he met somebody who answered his questions. And Brian and I travel the world doing these events. Now look, in the settings I'm in, scientific settings, classroom settings, it's always great to have a physicist as you back up. I was thinking about the story of the scientist that traveled around, gave a lecture, and he had a chauffeur that took him everywhere, and night after night giving the same lecture. And finally one night he gets into the limousine and he tells the chauffeur, he said, I'm just so sick of giving this lecture. And the chauffeur said, I think I've heard you give it so much, I think I could do it. And the chauffeur and the scientist said, really? So they changed clothes. The chauffeur became the scientist, and the scientist sat down to take the night off. And so the chauffeur gets up pretending to be the scientist and writes out all the equations perfectly, just amazed the crowd. Everything was going great until the question and answer. And somebody in the back raised their hand and had this very complicated question. And so the guy posing to be the scientist paused. He said, you know, that question is so simple. I'm going to have my chauffeur come up here and answer that. Come on up here. Helps to have a chauffeur. Reasons to believe. Real faith isn't blind. Number 3, if you want to have a great process of evangelism, you're going to need evangelists. One of the things I found in my research is that what's missing in the American church is the ministry of the evangelist. Now, that doesn't mean evangelists aren't doing crusades, and there's many great revivalists, but really when it comes to the culture of a church, the evangelist's primary gift is to equip the saints, and that gift, for the most part, is missing from the church. In fact, I took the 20 top books on missional church. If you know the term missional church, I took the 20 top books and analyzed them. Very few even mention the word evangelist. Even fewer tried to describe what they do, and none of them said anything about how do you train one. And yet the very gift that God gave to make the church missional is missing from the team. You've seen basketball teams where you think, man, we need a great point guard, or we need a two guard, a shooting guard, or we need somebody that'll get the rebounds. This is a missing component. In fact, when I went to do my doctoral dissertation, I did it on the gift of the evangelist. I'm going to sound like Barney Fife here, bragging on myself, but when it was published, they said, to the best of our knowledge, this is the first doctoral dissertation in the world on the gift of the evangelist. Thousands of dissertations on evangelism. Why so little on, or nothing on the evangelist? Could it be that if we can recover that ministry and that function, and that's what we do, that's one of the things we're here to help you do, is to figure out, how do you know? It's kind of like the old thing, how do you know you're a redneck? Well, if you buy your clothes or you buy your food, you might be a redneck. How do you know you're an evangelist? There's certain little markers that tell that, but you as pastors and leaders probably already know the people that have this gift in your midst. There is no such thing as the gift of evangelism. There's the evangelist, and our research says it's about 1%. There's about 1% of the people that have this gift, and so if you can find that 1%, if you have a church of 1,000, then you've got 10. Train those, and they become like the personal trainers that can get in and can work with the people and help the 99% who are not evangelists become missional, become evangelistic minded, memorizing and mastering the gospel, understanding the reasons. Evangelist. Charles Spurgeon, I saw a study on Charles Spurgeon's church planting methods. When Spurgeon dedicated the Metropolitan Tabernacle in 1867, he said, I will plant 100 churches in London before I die. Now think about it. You're building a mega church, and yet you're going to plant 100 churches in the same city? And Spurgeon did 2 things. The first thing he did was he started a pastor school, which, if you remember lectures to my students, that was the lectures that Spurgeon gave to the students. The next thing he did, which is not known very widely, is that he started an evangelist association. He had 100 evangelists, and they did just what Pastor John did, where they go in and they're sent to different parts of London. In fact, Spurgeon had identified over 700 what he called preaching stations in London. And so these evangelists would go into these different needy areas of the city and would preach. As soon as they had a breakthrough, they would put a pastor in from the pastor school. It started working so well, they'd put another 100 evangelists in the rest of the British Isles. Spurgeon died in 1892, so within 25 years, Spurgeon didn't plant 100 churches in London. He planted 200 churches in London and another 200 in the rest of the British Isles. By the combination of the evangelists partnering with the pastors, with the leadership team. I can tell you're underwhelmed, so I'll just encourage myself. That's a good point. Praise God. When LeBron James was drafted, he got up and he thanked himself. So if he can thank himself, I just encourage myself. It's all right. That's okay. That's okay. Now, you don't have to do that. We're spelling the word great, the word approach. Now, this word, when it comes to evangelism, is critical. This is my new favorite word because approach is how you come near someone to make a proposal. Look it up. Just Google approach. It's the coolest word, and when I'm training and we're talking about evangelism, how you approach somebody is everything. We give out another acronym. I hate to bore you with it, but it basically goes like this. It goes: start a conversation, ask questions, listen, and then tell the story. Now, I'm going to combine the last 2 points for the sake of time. I have many things to share with you today, but you cannot bear them all now. On your seat is a little thing called the Human Rights Survey. I need one of those if there's Rick Zarecki, who looks like the little kid from Sandlot. Come on up here, who grew up. You start a conversation, you ask questions, you listen, and then you tell the story. You know, it's an amazing thing that when you just have that kind of flip of the script, we're good at the talk method. When that could be stand for you start talking, you argue, you get louder, and then you kick folks. I found that when you start a conversation, I'm on an airplane and I'm looking at a woman and she was actually reading a Bible. And I thought, I'll just give her a nice little charismatic, charismatics, Pentecostals, we like to kind of smack, hallelujah. So, you're a Christian. She snapped her head at me. She goes, no, I believe I am God. And she's basically saying she's God and she's trying to discover who she is. Now, to show you how bold I am, let me tell you how bold I am. I looked at this woman and I said, don't let me bother you. A few minutes later, it was like the Lord spoke to me and said, you're the only one strange enough to talk to this weirdo. I said, ma'am, if you're God, I got a lot of questions for you. You'll find people, when you start asking questions, it's amazing. They'll go, my religion's personal. It's a personal thing. Usually I'm thinking, yeah, it's so personal, you haven't discussed it with yourself yet. But it's amazing when you start these conversations, you ask questions, you listen and tell the story, what happens? I created a little tool, and for the sake of time, it's called the God Test. You can download it free it should be out on Android today, but it's definitely out in the iTunes store. It's all the training there, it's all free. We've had thousands of people that are being trained in it, and it's simply this method of just you ask questions. When I went to meet in Springfield and I heard about the human right, I said, this is incredible because the human right is I grew up hearing the Great Commission. But the human right gives the Great Commission to a new generation in a way that they understand it because they're passionate about rights. And so let me tell you something. This thing called the human right, to me, just what a thrust it could produce. And so for Heath and all of you that are involved in that, we created a little tool called the Human Rights Survey, and it really is like the God Test. You open it up, and it's got some questions here. And we're going to start conversations, we're going to ask questions, we're going to listen. And I have found this, that if you listen to someone long enough, they'll give you the chance to talk back. This little thing here, once you take the survey, this easily tears off. And then here in the Human Rights Survey, it's got a little presentation. I love this at the end because it says you have the right to know. You know, when you read somebody their rights when they get arrested, you got to make sure you read them their rights. You know what? I think every person, I think the human right is saying this, every person's got a right to know Jesus, yes, and to know the gospel. God became man in Jesus Christ. He lived the life we should have lived. He died the death we should have died in our place. 3 days later, he rose from the dead. What did that mean? Proved he was the Son of God. Christianity is the only religion in the world that bases everything on one historical event. Karl Popper, the scientist who came up with falsification, that if something isn't falsifiable, that it isn't science. Christianity is the only religion that is falsifiable because Paul said, if the resurrection didn't happen, then your faith is worthless. Islam doesn't do it, Hinduism, no religion antes it all up, forgive the poker analogy, antes it all up and says, if this did not happen, it's not true. Let me give you a little taste of this, if I can, if that video can play. This is going into UCLA, and we're starting conversations, we're asking questions. You'll get a little flavor of not how just the God test, but how you can begin to engage people with the gospel. We're coming into UCLA. We're going to start some conversations. We're going to ask questions. We're going to listen, and then we're going to tell the story.
One man awakens another. Second one awakes his next door brother. Three awake and rise it down and turn the whole place upside down.
So the question is, do you believe in God?
Absolutely.
So here's the questions. You say, so what are the main reasons you'd say you're an agnostic?
There's definitely something out there that was intelligent enough to create whatever world we live in, to create, genomes, atoms, genetic codes, the way that someone looks, the way that the grass is green. There has to be some sort of an intelligent design.
I'd say the greenery, the forestry around here. I feel like all that came from somebody. All that came from a creator. Someone created all this.
Okay, so you would accept that. Would you say that would be God?
Yeah, it could be God, it could be dog, it could be OGD, it could be one of those affiliations. Yeah.
I don't believe that there is any true proof that there is just the God that's described in different religious books.
What do you think God expects of us?
I don't think he expects anything. I think he just expects us to live our lives and try to be good people.
Let me just get it straight. So you'd say, I don't believe, you believe in the designer.
I believe in some sort of higher power out there that had something to do with the creation of this universe.
But biological proof that would point to the God of the Bible.
There isn't.
Okay.
I don't believe there's biological proof.
Okay. Let's just take the word good. How you doing on a scale of 1 to 10?
I feel like I'm a 9.
What is the basis of your morality? Would you say you're a moral person?
Right and wrong is defined by the society you live in. I would say I'm a generally good person just because my parents are good people.
Yeah. Do you believe you will go to heaven?
No. There's no way of determining what gets you to heaven.
I think you already know enough to know that there's something there that you've not been willing to say, I believe. And here's what the gospel says. The gospel says is that God, his creator, becomes a man in Jesus Christ. And he lives the life we should have lived. He lived perfectly the moral law. And then he died the death we should have died in our place. What I'm asking you, Doug, is were you willing to trust the only one in the universe that came, proved his love for you, and said, Doug, I died for you? You willing to do that?
Absolutely.
You say this out loud. Say, Lord Jesus, I know you're real.
Second one awakes his next door brother. Three awake and rouse it down by turning the whole place upside down. Many awake will cause such a fuss. It finally wakes the rest of us. One man awakes with dawn in his eyes. Surely then it multiplies.
Could we stand together as we close? Please stand. This might be awkward, but would you grab the hand of the person next to you? I don't think anyone would object to the reality of what's happening now, that the tectonic plates of our culture are shifting. And this is a moment where our children are in the balance, not just our children, but everybody out on these campuses are somebody's child. They're in our youth groups. They can be equipped, they can be prepared. Memorizing and mastering the gospel, giving the solid answers, the reasons to believe. Having evangelists in your midst, meaning that, and that can be apologetic folks, people that can help train, learning the right approach, and then the final one that I mentioned quickly is tools. You've got the Human Rights Survey. You've got so many tools that we have offered. God's not dead, it's just a tool. But it doesn't matter if we don't have the heart. So Lord, today, we're asking you to do something. I don't even know the language for it other than to say that you came to seek and save the lost. Lord, may we become people, as we heard this morning, that our passion for you is not just, as we heard today, expressed in our worship, But even as you, Jesus, took that passion and expressed it to your fellow man and expressed it to those in need, Lord, may we take and carry the passion that we have from this conference, and may it be matched with a preparation, with understanding these key principles of mastering the gospel, learning some basic reasons for our faith, being able to have an approach that is winsome and able to approach someone in a non-awkward way, but yet to still start this conversation that's so critical. Lord, I thank you for what you've done in this magnificent group of people called the Assembly of God. Lord, they have excelled, they have grown, they have demonstrated their passion for you over 100 years. They have the track record. Thank you for allowing me this moment just to say, Lord, that whatever this has done and whatever has happened, Lord, you want to do exceedingly abundantly beyond what they ask or think. I ask you that you do that in this group, in these people, for your glory in Jesus' name. Amen.